How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? In this blog, I'm going to have a chat about inflation. Like most articles on the future, the best anyone can do is to put forward a hypothesis, but in this article I want to discuss at least something which will give us a few ground rules from which to base any thoughts about where we're headed. I've been listening to a talk by Nick Hubble. Maybe you should check him out. He's definitely worth a read. But I want to pick up on some of the things he's been saying about a useful little phrase. MV equals PY. It's a useful little phrase to start off things when talking about an economy and how it's functioning and where it's going. M stands for the money supply, V is the velocity of that money, P stands for prices, and Y is real GDP. Of course, all of these functions aren't necessarily easy to compute in the first place. What is the money supply? Does it include the reserves? Does it include credit? How about other things? For example, V, velocity of money. There are also some strange implications when talking about that. If the same £5 note goes from being used once a day to being used twice a day, it's going to feel as if there's twice as much money sloshing around the system. How about quantitative easing? That's undoubtedly increased the money supply, but it was used as reserves instead of being used in daily transactions, so its velocity was low. P is simply a way of representing inflation, which is rising prices, or deflation, which of course is falling prices. This also is a difficult figure to assess, as some prices go up, some prices go down, and what's actually in the basket. There are also some tricks of the trade which interfere with those figures. One such trick is called hedonics, but I don't want to get too technical here. Let's just accept for the moment that we're talking about the price of a basket of basic items used by most people in their normal daily life. Gosh, there are even problems with defining GDP. If instead of mowing my lawn I pay someone else to do it, how has that increased the country's GDP? The state is no more well off the day after my lawn has been mowed, but money has changed hands. Yes, quite. Economics is a very inexact science, and we're supposed to be using this stuff to try and chart our way into the future. Hey ho, hey ho. All right, we've defined our terms as best we can, but what does the equation actually mean? Let's do a translation. Nick uses the following explanation, or I'll quote him. In an economy, the amount of money, M, times the speed with which it's spent, V, is equal to the price of stuff, P, times the amount of stuff, Y. I've always maintained that the most important indicator in maths is the equals sign, and the whole point of this equation is that if you double the money supply, the other side of the equation has to double as well. The real problem with that assumption is that if you double the money supply, sort of like QE, but the velocity of that money halves, nothing changes on the other side of the equation. In other words, there's no inflation. There is a bit of a weird corollary to that observation. If the government introduces a digital currency, let me rephrase that. When the government introduces a digital currency, that currency can be programmed to expire if not used. Expiring money encourages people to spend it faster, which increases V, velocity. This would have a stimulus effect on prices or a stimulus effect on spending to spur on GDP. And that's precisely what the governments of the world want in order to get inflation to eat away at their deficits. During the pandemic, the lockdowns meant that the economy, Y, crashed. Apparently, it was the biggest drop in GDP in the UK for 300 years. On the other side of the equation, the velocity of that money, V, plunged. People saved instead of spending. In fact, they were prevented from doing quite a lot of spending. Central bankers responded to this drop in V by creating insane amounts of money, M, to try and pump up the economy, Y, and keep prices stable, P. Is everybody happy? Hope you're on top of this. If you need a rest and a brandy, do take a break. Okay, it's consequences time. As economies round the world come back to some semblance of normality, spending is going to return. All that increase in M is going to circulate faster, triggering a spike in inflation. Actually, that's starting to happen right now, but how much higher is inflation likely to rise? Of course, there are too many variables in the equation to get this sort of right, but we'll still have a go. Nick says, if V returns to its pre-pandemic level, that would equal a rise of 27%. The Federal Reserve is anticipating economic growth of 6.5% in 2021 in the USA. That's the end of his quote. If you assume no more QE, which is probably an unrealistic assumption, but let's do the sums, then the left-hand side of the equation has increased by 27%. So the other side must equal that, which means 27 minus that 6.5 GDP equals 20.5% worth of inflation. It's rather a lot. If M, that's the money side, increases with more QE, and V, the velocity, increases because in an inflationary environment people spend money faster before it loses its value, then the figures are going to show inflation far higher than 20%. Okay, inflation rises, so interest rates rise to help damp down the problem. Rates ought to rise to compensate for holding debt. But governments want inflation to eat away at their debt, so that is going to be resisted as much as possible. The only way I can see they can do that is by cutting down on their spending or by refraining from borrowing to finance their obligations. There is, I believe, something like $8 trillion that will need refinancing at the end of this year in the USA alone. The only way out of that problem, seems to me, is to print the money to pay off the debt. If they don't have to borrow, that will take the pressure off a rate rise. An interest rate rise will trigger a deflationary debt crisis like the one in 2008, but with far higher levels of debt today, any crash would have more far-reaching consequences. Then there's the risk of stagflation. In the USA, there is a disappointing jobs number, and there are rather a lot of supply shortages. In short, it looks as though there's more money printing to come. Expect the dollar to fall against other currencies. On this side of the pond, an inflation spike might force the ECB into raising interest rates on heavily indebted South European countries, and inflation has already risen above the ECB's mandate. Not that that little inconvenience will bother Christine Lagarde. However, the bottom line is that no one knows where this mess is headed, but the signs are not good. For the moment, I'm tentatively suspecting inflation to rise at least to the levels last seen in the 70s. 25% to 30% is perfectly feasible, certainly on the current figures. Let's hope it doesn't get that bad, but it would be sensible to be prepared. And those inflation figures will screw the housing market, as price rises in that range would seriously impact on disposable income. That's the way things seem to be heading at the moment. I thought you ought to know. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Please like. And if there's more to come, See you next week.